Ethan Caldwell had built his billion-dollar empire on cold efficiency, never questioning who paid the price for his success. But on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a collision with a small girl in a red hoodie would shatter everything. When his wallet disappeared, Ethan's rage led him to chase the 8-year-old through Manhattan streets, while cameras turned him into a viral villain. Yet what he discovered would force him to confront a devastating truth. The little girl wasn't a thief. She was a daughter fighting to save her dying mother, and the tragedy that drove her to desperation traced directly back to decisions made in Ethan's own company. Today, a stolen wallet would reveal the true cost of looking away. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across Fifth Avenue as Ethan Caldwell stepped out of his black Mercedes, the door held open by his driver. At 42, Ethan moved through the world with the precision of a man who had built an empire on calculated decisions and zero tolerance for mistakes. His navy suit was custom-tailored, his watch worth more than most people's cars, and his expression carried the permanent chill of someone who had learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'll be 20 minutes, he told his driver, adjusting his cufflinks as he surveyed the busy Manhattan sidewalk. The financial district hummed with its usual morning chaos. Tourists snapping photos, professionals rushing to meetings, street vendors calling out their offerings. Ethan barely noticed any of it. He had a meeting with the board in an hour, and he needed his usual espresso from the corner cafe before facing another round of quarterly projections. The cafe's glass door reflected his image back at him. Tall, sharp-featured, graying slightly at the temples, in a way that added gravitas rather than age. He reached for the handle just as a small figure barreled around the corner. The impact was slight, barely enough to make him stumble, but sudden enough to catch him off guard. A child, a little black girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, bounced off his leg and stumbled backward. She wore an oversized red hoodie that hung past her hips, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her small hands. Her hair formed a halo of tight curls around her face, and a worn backpack hung heavily from one shoulder. "Sorry," she mumbled, not quite meeting his eyes. Her voice was soft, almost swallowed by the street noise around them. Before Ethan could respond, not that he would have done much beyond a dismissive nod, the girl darted away, weaving between pedestrians with the practiced ease of someone who knew these streets intimately. He watched her red hoodie disappear into the crowd for half a second before turning back to the cafe entrance. His hand moved automatically to smooth down his jacket. That's when his fingers found empty fabric where his inside pocket should have held weight. His wallet was gone. Ethan's entire body went rigid. His hand patted the pocket again, then checked his other pockets with increasing urgency. Nothing. The sleek black leather wallet that held not just his credit cards and identification, but the only photograph he still carried of his late wife, had vanished. His mind replayed the collision in an instant. The girl. The bump. Her quick retreat. Ethan's jaw clenched as his eyes scanned the crowded sidewalk. There, about 50 yards ahead, the red hoodie bobbed between two businessmen. The girl was moving fast, clutching something dark against her chest. "Stop!" The word erupted from Ethan's throat before he could think. Heads turned. A woman with a stroller jumped. The girl's head whipped around, her eyes went wide, and then she ran. Ethan took off after her, his polished Italian leather shoes slapping against the concrete. Around him, people pulled out their phones. Some moved aside, others deliberately stepped into his path. A man in a delivery uniform muttered something hostile as Ethan pushed past. The girl was small and quick, darting through gaps that Ethan had to shoulder through. She jumped over a dog leash, skirted around a hot dog cart, and flew across a crosswalk just as the light changed. Ethan followed, ignoring the honking horns and shouted curses from drivers. "Someone stop her!" he yelled, but his words had the opposite effect. The crowd seemed to close ranks around the girl, their faces turning hostile as they recognized what they were seeing. A wealthy white man in an expensive suit chasing a poor black child through the streets of Manhattan. A teenager deliberately stepped into Ethan's path, forcing him to stumble. "Leave her alone, man." "She stole my wallet," Ethan gasped, but his explanation was drowned out by the growing murmur of disapproval from onlookers. The girl veered right into a narrow alley between two buildings. Ethan followed, his breath coming harder now. The alley was dimmer, lined with dumpsters and fire escapes. The girl's red hoodie flashed ahead of him as she ran deeper into the shadows. Behind him, Ethan could hear voices, footsteps. People were following, recording. He could imagine the headlines already, the social media posts, the damage to his reputation. But none of that mattered as much as the photograph in that wallet. The last picture taken of Sarah before the cancer took her, before his world became nothing but numbers and cold decisions. "Just give it back," he called out, his voice echoing off the brick walls. The girl didn't answer. She kept running, her small legs pumping, her backpack bouncing. She stumbled once, caught herself against a wall, and kept going. When she reached the end of the alley, she skidded to a stop. A chain-link fence blocked her path, easily 8 feet tall, topped with barbed wire. She grabbed the metal links, shaking them desperately. Locked. Ethan slowed to a walk, his chest heaving. Sweat dampened his collar despite the cool morning air. He approached carefully, hands slightly raised, aware of how this must look. "Why did you take it?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, edged with anger and something else, a pain he didn't want to acknowledge. The girl pressed herself against the fence, clutching the wallet to her chest with both hands. Up close, Ethan could see she was trembling. Her eyes were huge in her small face, not defiant but terrified. Dirt smudged one cheek and her sneakers had holes in the toes. "Why?" he repeated, softer this time. She looked up at him, tears forming in her eyes, and said something that made his breath catch. "It's not yours anymore." The words hung in the air between them, strange and unsettling. Before Ethan could process what she meant, sirens wailed from the street. Blue and red lights flickered off the alley walls. Someone had called the police. 2 officers appeared at the alley entrance, hands on their belts, assessing the situation. Behind them, a small crowd had gathered, phones still recording. Ethan could hear their commentary, a rising tide of judgment. "He chased her all the way here. She's just a kid. Probably thought she was shoplifting or something. Look how scared she is." One of the officers, a stocky man with sergeant stripes, walked forward slowly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the child." "She took my wallet," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice level and reasonable. "I'm not trying to hurt her. I just want my property back." The other officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, knelt down near the girl. "Honey, are you okay? Did this man hurt you?" The girl shook her head mutely, pressing harder against the fence. Her knuckles were white around the wallet. "We can sort this out," the sergeant said to Ethan. "But right now, you need to give her some space. These folks here say you've been chasing her for 3 blocks. Because she stole from me." Ethan's frustration leaked through. He gestured at the wallet. "That's mine. Check the ID inside if you don't believe me." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, angrier. Someone shouted, "Billionaire bullying a little girl." Another voice added, "This is going viral, buddy." Ethan's mind raced. His board meeting, his reputation, the optics of this situation. Every instinct screamed at him to establish control, to explain, to make these people understand that he was the victim here. But when he looked at the girl again, something in her expression stopped him cold. She wasn't looking at him with the cunning of a thief. She looked desperate. haunted. And her lips were moving, whispering something he couldn't hear. The female officer reached out gently. "Sweetheart, can you give me what you're holding?" The girl's response was to duck. In a move that surprised everyone, she dropped to her hands and knees and scrambled through a bezetad's gap in the fence, a section where the chain link had been cut and poorly repaired, creating a space just large enough for a small child to squeeze through. "Wait," the officer called. But the girl was already through, running into the maze of narrow streets and old buildings that lay beyond the commercial district. Ethan moved without thinking. He grabbed the fence, trying to pull himself up, but his shoes slipped and his suit jacket caught on the wire. By the time he freed himself, the girl had disappeared around a corner. "Sir, stop," the sergeant said firmly. "Let us handle this." "You don't understand," Ethan said, surprising himself with the raw emotion in his voice. "That wallet, there's something in it I can't lose." The officers exchanged glances. The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "We'll do our best to locate her, but you need to come with us to file a proper report. Can you describe the child?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. The crowd was still filming. Every word he said would be analyzed, dissected, turned into evidence of his character, or lack thereof. And somewhere in his mind, the girl's words echoed again. "It's not yours anymore. Black female, approximately 8 years old," he heard himself say in a flat, business-like tone. Red hoodie, jeans, worn backpack. She went that way. As the officers began clearing the crowd and calling for backup, Ethan noticed something on the ground near where the girl had squeezed through the fence. A piece of paper, torn and dirty, with something written on it in a child's uneven handwriting. He bent down and picked it up while the sergeant was distracted. The note was barely legible, written in purple crayon on what looked like the back of a grocery receipt. "Don't let them take Mama. I'll get it back. Zuri." Ethan stared at the note, his anger cooling into something more complicated. This wasn't about simple theft. Something else was happening here. Something he didn't understand. "Mr. Caldwell," the female officer had returned. "I'll need your contact information for our report." He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, away from the officer's view. Something told him he needed to understand this situation before involving more authorities. As he provided his information and answered the officer's questions, Ethan's mind was already working through the puzzle. A child's note about someone's mother. The desperate fear in her eyes. The way she'd said his wallet wasn't his anymore, as if she'd earned it somehow. The crowd slowly dispersed, disappointed that there wouldn't be a more dramatic conclusion. The officers finished their preliminary report and told Ethan they'd be in touch if they located the child. He nodded, gave them his business card, and walked back toward the street where his driver was waiting, probably worried after all this time. But when Ethan reached the mouth of the alley, he paused. To his left was his car, his meeting, his carefully controlled world. To his right was the direction the girl had run, into a part of the city he'd never visited, never thought about, never acknowledged existed just blocks from his polished office tower. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. "Board meeting in 30 minutes. Where are you?" Ethan looked at the message, then at the gap in the fence. His rational mind told him to let the police handle it, to get back to his life, to write off the wallet and order replacements for everything in it. The photograph could be mourned in private, as he'd mourned Sarah herself. Alone, efficiently, without disrupting the machinery of his existence. But his feet didn't move toward the car. Instead, against every logical impulse, he walked toward the fence. He found a section where he could climb over, ungracefully, tearing his jacket in the process, and dropped down on the other side. The neighborhood beyond was like stepping into a different world. The buildings were older, paint peeling, windows cracked or boarded up. Laundry hung between fire escapes. Small gardens grew in repurposed containers on stoops. Children's chalk drawings covered the sidewalk, faded but still visible. Ethan felt utterly out of place in his expensive suit, now rumpled and torn. People stared at him from doorways and porches, suspicious, wary stares that made him acutely aware of how he must appear. An interloper. A threat. He walked slowly, scanning for any sign of the red hoodie. The streets here twisted in ways that didn't match the neat grid of the financial district. He passed a bodega with barred windows, a church with a tilting steeple, a lot full of broken furniture and weeds. On the corner, sitting on the steps of a weathered brownstone, an older black woman watched him approach. She wore a flower print dress and held a fan despite the cool morning air. Her eyes tracked him with the alertness of someone who missed nothing in her neighborhood. Ethan stopped a respectful distance away. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for a young girl, about 8 years old, wearing a red hoodie. Her name might be Zuri." The woman's expression hardened. She stopped fanning herself. "And why would you be looking for Zuri?" "She has something of mine. I just want to talk to her." "That what you tell the police, too?" The woman's voice carried decades of distrust, earned through experience. "We saw the videos. You chased that baby through the streets like she was a criminal." "She took my wallet," Ethan said, then added more quietly. "But I think there's more to it than that. I found a note. Something about her mother." The woman studied him for a long moment. "If you're looking for Zuri, you better have a good reason. That child's been through enough. Lost her daddy not 3 years back. Her mama's been sick ever since. And now here you come, big man in a fancy suit, probably looking to make things worse." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He thought of the note again. The fear in the girl's eyes. "I don't want to make things worse. I just want to understand." "Understanding don't pay hospital bills," the woman said, "and it don't bring back the dead." She stood up, joints creaking, and walked inside without another word. The door closed firmly behind her, leaving Ethan alone on the empty street. He continued walking, more slowly now, paying attention to his surroundings. This neighborhood had a rhythm different from the one he knew. Quieter, more personal. People knew each other here. They looked out for each other. And they clearly saw him as an outsider, possibly a threat to one of their own. He passed a small corner store with a hand-painted sign advertising groceries and check cashing. Through the window, he could see an elderly man behind the counter, organizing lottery tickets. On impulse, Ethan went inside. The old man looked up, his weathered face neutral. "Help you?" "I'd like to buy some food," Ethan said. "Sandwiches, fruit, whatever you'd recommend." The man's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't comment. He assembled a bag of items. Fresh bread, apples, some wrapped sandwiches from a small deli case. Ethan paid with the emergency cash he kept in his jacket pocket, grateful he hadn't lost everything with the wallet. As he was leaving, he glanced through the window and froze. Across the street near a rusted playground was a flash of red. The girl, Zuri, was crouched down next to a smaller child, a boy who looked about 5. She was helping him tie his shoe, her movements patient and careful. The boy said something that made her smile, a real smile that transformed her frightened face into something brighter. Ethan watched as she took the boy's hand and carefully walked him across the street, checking both ways twice, making sure he was safe. There was nothing furtive or guilty in her manner. She moved like a child who had learned to be responsible too young, who carried weight that should have been held by adults. When she reached the other side, she knelt down and said something to the boy, then pointed toward a nearby building. The boy nodded and ran off, his untied shoelace now secure. Zuri watched until he was safely inside, then turned, and saw Ethan through the store window. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Zuri ran again, this time in a different direction. Ethan burst out of the store and followed, but kept his distance this time, trying not to spook her. She glanced back once, saw he wasn't sprinting after her, and slowed to a fast walk. She led him deeper into the neighborhood, past buildings that showed signs of long neglect and recent attempts at repair. Eventually, she turned toward a structure that made Ethan's breath catch. It was a hospital, small, old, the kind of community facility that probably struggled for funding. The sign read, St. Mary's Community Medical Center, with several letters missing or faded. An ambulance sat in the bay, one door hanging crooked on its hinges. Zuri walked straight through the entrance. Ethan followed at a distance, trying to look like he belonged despite his torn suit and general dishevelment. Inside, the hospital had the worn-down feeling of a place doing its best with limited resources. The floor tiles were cracked, the paint was yellowing, and the waiting room chairs looked like they'd been donated in the 1980s. But it was clean, and the staff moved with purpose. A nurse at the front desk looked up and smiled when she saw Zuri. "You're late again, sweetheart." "I know, Miss Patricia, I'm sorry." Zuri's voice was small, apologetic. "Your mama was asking for you. Room 347, same as always." Ethan hung back, pretending to read a notice board about flu shots while Zuri headed for the elevator. When the doors closed behind her, he approached the desk. "Excuse me," he said to the nurse, who eyed his disheveled appearance with professional suspicion. "I'm here to inquire about a patient, Zuri's mother." "And you are?" Ethan hesitated, unsure what to call himself. "A friend. I wanted to help with her medical expenses." The nurse's expression shifted from suspicion to tired sympathy. "Sir, if you're from a charity organization, you need to go through the proper channels. We get people coming in here all the time promising help that never materializes. It just gives people false hope. I'm not from a charity, He pulled out one of the business cards the police hadn't taken. "I'm willing to help personally." The nurse took the card, her eyes widening as she read it. "Ethan Caldwell." "The Ethan Caldwell? The CEO?" "Yes." She looked at him with new suspicion, a different kind. "What's your interest in Zuri's mother?" Before Ethan could answer, a doctor emerged from a back hallway, reviewing a chart. He was young, probably fresh out of residency, with tired eyes and coffee stains on his white coat. He nearly walked past them, then did a double take when he saw Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, from Caldwell Financial?" The doctor's entire demeanor changed, his spine straightening. "I'm Dr. James Whitmore. Is there something we can help you with? Are you here for a consultation?" The sudden shift in treatment wasn't lost on Ethan, or the nurse, who looked away uncomfortably. He'd seen it countless times before, the way his wealth opened doors and smoothed paths. Usually he accepted it without thought. Today, it made him feel slightly sick. "I'm inquiring about a patient," he said. "The mother of a girl named Zuri. I'd like to know about her condition and her medical bills." Dr. Whitmore's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "That's confidential information, Mr. Caldwell. I can't discuss a patient's case without proper authorization." "I understand. But hypothetically, if someone wanted to help with outstanding medical costs, we have plenty of patients with outstanding costs." The nurse interrupted, her tone sharp. "Zuri's mama isn't the only one suffering because she can't afford proper treatment. You going to help all of them?" The challenge in her voice was clear. Ethan met her eyes. "What if I did?" She blinked, caught off guard. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps we should discuss this in my office." "No." Ethan kept his attention on the nurse. "You're right. There are many people suffering. But right now, I'm asking about one specific case. What would it take to ensure Zuri's mother receives proper treatment?" The nurse and doctor exchanged glances. Finally, the nurse sighed. "Amara Carter. Stage 3 lung disease, possibly environmental exposure." She needs regular treatments, medications, and eventually might need a transplant. Her insurance lapsed 6 months ago when she couldn't work anymore. The hospital's been treating her at reduced rates, but even that's more than that poor baby can manage. How much does she owe? Around 30,000, and climbing with each treatment. We've been doing what we can, but there are limits to charity care, even here. Ethan processed this. $30,000. For him, that was a rounding error, barely worth noticing on his monthly statements. For Zuri, it was apparently worth stealing a wallet from a stranger. And with proper payment, her treatment would improve. Dr. Whitmore spoke carefully. With proper funding, we could provide more aggressive treatment options, yes. Better medications, more frequent monitoring. It wouldn't cure her, but it would significantly improve her quality of life and prognosis. Through a nearby window, Ethan could see the hallway leading to the patient rooms. He couldn't see into the rooms themselves, but he imagined Zuri in one of them sitting beside her sick mother, clutching a stolen wallet because she had no other options. His wallet, his property, his photograph of Sarah, but also, apparently, Zuri's last desperate gamble to save her mother's life. "I'll pay it," he said quietly. "The full amount, plus enough to cover future treatments." Dr. Whitmore's eyes widened. "Mr. Caldwell, that's incredibly generous, but I have to ask, why? What's your connection to this family?" Ethan didn't have a good answer. He thought about saying it was simple charity or guilt or civic duty. But the truth was more complicated and less comfortable. "A little girl stole my wallet this morning," he said. "I chased her through the streets, called the police on her, terrified her. And then I found out why she did it." He looked at the nurse. "She did it for her mother. Because people like me built a world where an 8-year-old child has to choose between being a thief and watching her mother die." The silence that followed was heavy. "I'd like this to be anonymous," Ethan continued. "The family shouldn't know it came from me. Can you arrange that?" "Yes," Dr. Whitmore said slowly. "Yes, we can do that." "Good. I'll have my accountant contact you this afternoon with payment details." Ethan turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. What room is she in?" 347, the nurse said softly. "Third floor." Ethan took the stairs instead of the elevator, giving himself time to think. Each step echoed in the concrete stairwell, the sound lonely and hollow. By the time he reached the third floor, he still didn't know what he was going to say if he encountered Zuri again. Room 347 was halfway down the hallway. The door was partially open, and through the gap, Ethan could see a woman lying in the hospital bed. She was thin, terribly thin, her dark skin almost gray with illness. An oxygen tube rested under her nose, and multiple IV lines ran from her arms. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Beside the bed, in a plastic chair too big for her small frame, sat Zuri. She'd removed her red hoodie, revealing a t-shirt with a faded cartoon character on it. Her backpack sat on the floor beside her, and on her lap, open and examined, was his wallet. Ethan watched through the gap as Zuri carefully removed his credit cards, his driver's license, his insurance cards. She set them aside in a neat pile. Then she found what she'd been looking for, the photograph of Sarah. Zuri held it up to the light, studying it with the serious attention of a child trying to understand the adult world. Sarah smiled out from the photo, frozen in time, forever healthy and whole, in a way Amara Carter would never be again. Something crumpled in Ethan's chest, a feeling he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Grief. Yes, but also recognition. He saw himself in that hospital room, sitting beside Sarah's bed in a facility much nicer than this one, watching her slip away despite the best doctors and most expensive treatments money could buy. He'd been helpless then, his billions useless against the simple biological fact of death. And now here was Zuri, facing the same helplessness but without the billions, without the resources, without any options except a stolen wallet and desperate hope. Zuri set the photograph down gently and picked up something else from inside the wallet, a small business card for an expensive art gallery. She flipped it over and, using a stubby pencil from her backpack, began to draw on the blank side. Ethan couldn't see what she was drawing, but he watched the concentration on her face, the way her tongue poked out slightly as she worked. When she finished, she looked at it for a moment, then carefully placed it back in the wallet, along with all his cards and the photograph. Then she did something that made Ethan's breath catch. She stood up, leaned over her mother's bed, and kissed her forehead gently. "I got help, Mama," she whispered. "The doctors are going to make you better now. I promise. I did what I had to do." Amara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Zuri? Baby?" "I'm here, Mama. I'm always here." "You're such a good girl," Amara murmured, already drifting back to unconsciousness. "My brave, good girl." Zuri climbed back into the chair and picked up his wallet again, holding it close like a talisman. "Just rest, Mama. Everything's going to be okay now." Ethan backed away from the door before they could notice him. He walked down the hallway, down the stairs, through the lobby, and out into the cool morning air. His phone had been buzzing constantly. Messages from his assistant, his board members, probably his legal team by now. He ignored all of them. Instead, he stood on the hospital steps and thought about a little girl who'd called him a billionaire while sitting in a plastic chair beside her dying mother, who'd stolen his wallet not for greed, but for love, who'd looked at him with terror in her eyes and said, "It's not yours anymore." She'd been right. The wallet wasn't his anymore. Neither was the careful control he'd maintained over his life, the walls he'd built to keep pain at bay, the cold efficiency that had made him rich and empty in equal measure. A little girl in a red hoodie had stolen more than his wallet that morning. She'd stolen the comfortable fiction that he was separate from the suffering around him, that his wealth was earned in isolation from the poverty that pressed against the borders of his polished world. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "The board is furious." "Cancel my meetings," he said. "What? Ethan, you can't just cancel them. Tell the board I'll speak with them tomorrow." Something came up. Something more important than a quarterly review. Ethan looked back at the hospital building, at the cracked windows and faded sign, at the place where a little girl was sitting beside her mother, still clutching a stolen wallet like a prayer. "Yes," he said quietly. "Something much more important." He ended the call and sat down on the hospital steps, prepared to wait. He didn't know what would happen when Zuri eventually emerged, whether she'd run again or finally let him speak. He didn't know if his anonymous payment would actually make a difference, or if he was just throwing money at his guilt. But for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell wasn't thinking about quarterly profits or board meetings or the careful maintenance of his empire. He was thinking about a drawing made on the back of a business card, about a mother dying in a charity hospital, about a child who'd been brave enough to steal for love. And he was thinking that maybe, just maybe, the truth he'd been running from wasn't about the wallet at all. It was about the man who'd been so empty that it took a child's theft to remind him he was human. The afternoon sun had shifted by the time Zuri finally emerged from the hospital, her red hoodie tied around her waist and her backpack hanging from one shoulder. Ethan had been sitting on the steps for nearly 2 hours, fielding increasingly frantic calls from his office until he'd finally powered off his phone completely. He stood as she pushed through the glass doors, and the moment she saw him, she froze. For several heartbeats, they stared at each other across the concrete steps. Zuri's hand instinctively moved to her backpack, where she'd tucked his wallet. Her eyes darted left and right, calculating escape routes with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to always have an exit plan. "I'm not here to chase you," Ethan said, keeping his voice level and quiet. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "I just want to talk." "About what?" Her voice was defiant, but he could hear the tremor underneath. "You already sent the police after me. I shouldn't have done that." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. "I was angry and I didn't understand what was happening." "You still don't understand." Zuri's grip tightened on her backpack strap. "People like you never do." The accusation stung because it was true. Ethan descended 2 steps, closing some of the distance between them, but staying far enough away not to seem threatening. "Then help me understand, please." Zuri's jaw set stubbornly. "Why should I?" "Because your mother is in there dying, and you shouldn't have to face that alone." The bluntness of his words made her flinch, but he continued. "Because you took my wallet for a reason, and I think that reason matters more than the wallet itself." "You have 100 wallets," she shot back. "You have everything. We don't have anything." "You're right. I do have everything. Or I thought I did." Ethan gestured at his torn suit, his disheveled appearance. "But a little girl showed me this morning that I don't even have the basic decency to ask questions before making assumptions." Zuri studied him warily, clearly trying to decide if this was some kind of trick. After a long moment, she reached into her backpack and pulled out his wallet. She held it out at arm's length, keeping maximum distance between them. "Here, take it. The doctors said they found extra funding for Mama's treatment. I don't need this anymore." Ethan took the wallet slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He opened it and found everything exactly where it should be. His cards, his identification, the photograph of Sarah. And tucked behind the photograph, drawn on the back of his art gallery business card, was a picture. It showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one small, one taller, standing under a large sun. Above the sun, in careful block letters, was written a single word: hope. Ethan's throat tightened as he stared at the drawing. "You made this?" "I was going to keep the picture of your wife," Zuri admitted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "She looks nice, like she was a good person. But that wouldn't be right, taking someone's memories, so I drew you a new one instead." "Why?" "Because you looked sad in your picture with her, and because—" She trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "Because my daddy died 3 years ago. I know what it's like to miss someone." "I thought maybe you needed hope, too." The simple kindness of the gesture, coming from a child who had every reason to hate him, was almost more than Ethan could bear. He carefully tucked the drawing back into his wallet, next to Sarah's photograph. "Thank you," he managed. "This is a—" "Thank you." Zuri shrugged uncomfortably, as if embarrassed by her own compassion. "Can I go now?" "Wait." Ethan stepped down one more step, now almost at her level. "Your father, how did he die?" Something shuddered in Zuri's expression. "Why do you care?" "Because I'm starting to think I should have cared a long time ago." She looked at him for a long moment, then sat down abruptly on the steps, as if the weight of carrying this story alone had finally become too heavy. Ethan sat down too, leaving a respectful distance between them. "There was a fire," Zuri said finally, her voice flat in the way children's voices get when they're trying not to cry. "At the warehouse where he worked. The building wasn't safe. Mama told him it wasn't safe. She worked there too, in the office part, and she kept writing reports about the bad wiring and the locked exits, but nobody listened." Ethan's stomach began to knot. "What warehouse?" "I don't remember the name. It was big and gray, out near the docks. They made parts for computers or something." She picked at a hole in her sneaker. "Daddy was working late when the fire started. A whole bunch of people died. Mama got out because she was near a window, but she breathed in a lot of smoke. That's why her lungs don't work right anymore." "When did this happen?" 3 years ago, November 15th. The date came out precise and painful. I was 5. We had a cake ready for Daddy's birthday the next day. We never got to give it to him. November 15th, 3 years ago. Ethan's mind raced through his company's history, through the subsidiaries and contractors and shell companies that made up his financial empire. He couldn't place a warehouse fire specifically, but that didn't mean his company wasn't involved. He'd built his success by delegating operations to managers who handled the details while he focused on the big picture: acquisitions, mergers, profit margins. The human cost had never been part of his calculations. "What was your father's name?" he asked quietly. "Marcus Carter." Pride crept into her voice despite the sadness. He was strong. He could lift me up over his head and spin me around. And he always came home with candy in his pockets, even when Mama said we couldn't afford it. Marcus Carter. Ethan committed the name to memory, along with a silent promise to find out exactly what happened in that warehouse. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Zuri looked at him skeptically. "You didn't even know him." "No, but I should have." Ethan met her eyes. "The people who worked in that warehouse, who died in that fire, they should have mattered to what people like me. They should have mattered more than profit margins and quarterly reports. You're just saying that because you feel guilty." "Yes," Ethan admitted. "I am guilty. Maybe not directly, but guilty nonetheless. And I don't know how to fix that, or if it can even be fixed. But I'd like to try." Zuri stood up abruptly. "You can't fix my daddy being dead, and you can't fix my mama being sick. Rich people always think money fixes everything, but it doesn't. It doesn't bring people back." She started walking down the steps, but Ethan called after her. "You're right. Money doesn't fix everything, but it can help your mother get better treatment. It can make sure you don't have to steal wallets to save the people you love." She stopped but didn't turn around. "The hospital found extra funding for your mother's care," Ethan continued. "That wasn't an accident. I paid her medical bills. All of them, plus enough to cover future treatments." Zuri spun around, her face a mixture of shock and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Because you shouldn't have to choose between right and wrong when the choice is really between survival and death. Because an 8-year-old girl shouldn't be carrying that kind of burden." He paused. "And because you showed me something I'd forgotten, that sometimes the most important things can't be measured in dollars." Tears welled up in Zuri's eyes, though she blinked them back fiercely. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity, it's—" Ethan struggled to find the right word. "It's an apology for not being the kind of person who would have prevented that fire in the first place, for building a world where children have to steal to save their parents." "You can't buy everything," she whispered, echoing her earlier words. "No, but maybe I can stand beside you while you figure out how to survive what can't be bought." They looked at each other across the steps, a billionaire in a torn suit and a little girl in worn sneakers, both carrying grief that money couldn't heal. Finally, Zuri wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mama's going to wonder where I am. I need to go back inside. Can I come with you?" The request surprised them both. Zuri hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but if you make her upset, I'll tell the nurses you're bothering us." "That's fair." They walked back into the hospital together, an unlikely pair that drew curious stares from the staff. The nurse at the front desk, Patricia, raised her eyebrows when she saw them, but said nothing. In the elevator, Zuri spoke quietly. "Mama's going to want to know who you are. What do you want me to tell her?" "The truth, I guess. She always says lying makes things worse." Zuri looked up at him. "Are you going to tell her I stole your wallet?" Ethan considered this. "No. I'll tell her you borrowed it and that you gave it back, which is the truth." A small smile flickered across Zuri's face. "You're weird for a rich person." "I'm starting to think being weird might be an improvement." Room 347 looked different now that Ethan was entering it properly, rather than spying from the hallway. The flowers he'd sent earlier, through the hospital, anonymously, sat on the windowsill in a simple vase. Amara Carter was awake, propped up on pillows, her eyes clearer than they'd been that morning, though still shadowed with pain and exhaustion. She looked up when they entered, her gaze immediately sharpening with protective concern when she saw a strange man with her daughter. "Mama, this is Mr. Caldwell," Zuri said quickly. He's the one who helped pay for your treatment." Amara's eyes widened. "You're the one who made the anonymous donation?" "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question was direct, tinged with the same skepticism her daughter had shown. "We don't know you. Why would you do that for us?" Ethan moved slowly into the room, stopping at a respectful distance from the bed. "Your daughter and I had an encounter this morning that made me realize I'd been living my life with my eyes closed. She opened them, in a way I didn't expect and probably didn't deserve." Amara looked between Ethan and Zuri, reading the subtext beneath his words. "What kind of encounter?" Before Zuri could speak, Ethan continued. "The kind where I learned that judging people by their circumstances instead of their character makes me exactly the kind of person I always claimed I wasn't. Your daughter showed me more courage and compassion in one morning than I've shown in years. It wasn't a lie, but it was a carefully edited truth." Amara seemed to sense this, but she also looked too tired to push for details. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," she said finally, gesturing to the plastic chair beside her bed. "If you're going to be mysterious, at least be comfortable while doing it." Ethan sat, aware of Zuri watching him carefully, ready to intervene if he said the wrong thing. The trust she was extending was fragile, and he had no intention of breaking it. "How are you feeling?" he asked Amara. "Like my lungs are full of broken glass," she said with blunt honesty. "But the doctors say with proper treatment, I might have years instead of months. That's more than I had yesterday." "Mama was a safety supervisor," Zuri said suddenly, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her mother's hand. "Before the fire. She tried to make them fix the problems, but they wouldn't listen." Amara's expression darkened. "Zuri, that's not—" "It's true, though. You showed me the reports you wrote. You told me how you begged them to fix the wiring and unlock the emergency exits, but they said it cost too much money." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. "Do you remember which company owned the warehouse?" Amara looked at him warily. "Why?" "Because I own a financial firm that contracts with dozens of manufacturers. If one of my subsidiaries was responsible, I need to know." "It won't bring Marcus back," Amara said softly. "No, but it might prevent the same thing from happening to someone else's husband, someone else's father." Amara studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Summit Industrial Fabrication. They were under contract with some bigger company, but I never knew which one. After the fire, they declared bankruptcy and disappeared. The workers' families got almost nothing in compensation. Summit Industrial Fabrication." Ethan didn't recognize the name immediately, but he would. He'd have his private investigator pull every contract, every subsidiary, every shell company connected to his empire. If there was a connection, he'd find it, and if he found it, he'd have to face what that meant. "I'll look into it," he promised. "Why?" Amara asked again, more gently this time. "Why do you care about a warehouse fire from 3 years ago?" Ethan looked at Zuri, who was watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. "Because your daughter taught me that ignoring the consequences of my choices doesn't make me innocent. It just makes me complicit." The room fell silent except for the quiet beep of Amara's monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital beyond the closed door. Finally, Amara spoke. "You can't fix this with money, Mr. Caldwell. I'm beginning to understand that, but maybe I can do something else. Maybe I can actually pay attention to where my money goes and who it hurts along the way. That would be a start, Amara said. She coughed, the sound wet and painful, and Zuri immediately reached for the water cup on the bedside table. Ethan stood. I should let you rest, but I'd like to come back if that's all right with you both. Not to throw money at problems, but just to be here. Zuri and Amara exchanged a look, one of those wordless mother-daughter communications that needed no translation. Okay, Zuri said finally. But bring books next time. I like books about kids who solve mysteries. I can do that. As Ethan reached the door, Amara called out softly. Mr. Caldwell, thank you. For the treatment, yes, but also for being honest with us. That matters more than you might think. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice, and left the room. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and pulled out his phone. 43 missed calls, 67 messages. His assistant had graduated from professional concern to barely restrained panic. He ignored all of it and dialed his private investigator instead. Marcus Carter died 3 years ago, November 15th, in a warehouse fire at Summit Industrial Fabrication. I need to know everything. Who owned the company, who held the contracts, who ignored the safety violations, and I need to know if any of it traces back to me. The investigator, a retired FBI agent named Dorothy Brennan, who Ethan had used for corporate intelligence for years, didn't ask unnecessary questions. How deep do you want me to dig? All the way down. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. I need the truth. Even if the truth is ugly. Ethan thought about Zuri's drawing, about the word hope, written in a child's careful handwriting. Especially if the truth is ugly. He ended the call and stood in the hospital hallway, surrounded by the sounds of suffering and healing, wealth and poverty, justice and its absence. His entire world had tilted on its axis in the space of a single morning, knocked off balance by a collision with an 8-year-old girl in a red hoodie. And for the first time in 3 years, since Sarah's death had frozen his heart into something cold and efficient, Ethan felt the ice beginning to crack. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan's life split into 2 parallel tracks that barely resembled each other. By day, he returned to his office and faced the growing crisis of his absence. The board demanded explanations for his erratic behavior. His investors questioned his judgment. Social media continued to dissect the video of him chasing a child through Manhattan, creating hashtags and memes that his PR team struggled to contain. He endured it all with a patience that surprised everyone, especially himself. He issued no statements, made no excuses, simply weathered the storm while his lawyers quietly worked behind the scenes to minimize the damage to the company's reputation. But every evening, after his office emptied and his assistant stopped hovering anxiously at his door, Ethan would loosen his tie, grab his coat, and drive to St. Mary's Community Hospital. The first few visits were awkward. He'd arrive with books for Zuri, mystery novels as requested, and sit quietly while she did homework at her mother's bedside. Amara watched him with the wary suspicion of someone who'd learned not to trust powerful people, but she didn't send him away. Gradually, the visits became less strange. Zuri would show him her schoolwork, and he'd help her with math problems. Amara would tell stories about Marcus, about the man her husband had been before the fire took him. Ethan would listen, storing away details about a life that had ended, because someone, somewhere in a chain of command that possibly led back to him, had decided that safety regulations cost too much. Dorothy Brennan called him on a Wednesday evening, while he was replacing a burned-out light bulb in Amara's hospital room. He'd noticed it flickering during his previous visit and had simply asked maintenance for a replacement bulb, then changed it himself, while Zuri giggled at the sight of a billionaire standing on a chair. I found the connection, Dorothy said without preamble when he answered. You're not going to like it. Ethan climbed down from the chair and stepped into the hallway, away from Zuri and Amara's hearing. Tell me. Summit Industrial Fabrication was a subsidiary of Brennan Holdings, which was contracted through your company's third-tier supply chain. Your signature isn't on any of the safety documents, but your executives used your name to authorize cost-cutting measures. Specifically, Greg Stanton signed off on delaying electrical upgrades at 3 facilities, including the one where the fire occurred. Greg, his COO, his right hand for the past decade, the man he'd trusted with operational oversight while he focused on expansion and acquisitions. How bad is it? Bad. The safety inspector who signed off on the facility was on Stanton's payroll. So was the local fire marshal. When Amara Carter filed her reports, they were intercepted and never made it to the proper oversight committees. After the fire, Stanton orchestrated the bankruptcy to shield the company from liability. The workers' families received minimal settlements, and the investigation was quietly closed. Ethan's hand tightened on his phone. Send me everything. Every document, every email, every payment record. Ethan, this could destroy your company. If this gets out, then it gets out. Send me everything. He ended the call and stood in the hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, feeling the full weight of what he'd just learned. His company, his name, had been used to cover up the negligence that killed Marcus Carter and 17 other people. Greg had done it to save money, to make the quarterly reports look better, to keep the stock price climbing. And Ethan had been so focused on the big picture that he'd never bothered to look at the human cost of that success. He returned to the room to find Zuri reading one of the mystery novels he'd brought, curled up in the chair with remarkable flexibility. Amara was dozing, her breathing easier now thanks to the improved medications the hospital could afford with his payment. Mr. Caldwell? Zuri looked up from her book. You okay? You look weird. I'm okay, he lied. Then, because she deserved better than lies, he corrected himself. Actually, I'm not okay. I just found out something difficult. About the fire? Her perceptiveness shouldn't have surprised him anymore, but it did. Yes. Was it your fault? The directness of the question was almost brutal. Not directly, but people who worked for me, using my name. Yes. Part of it was my fault. Zuri considered this, her expression serious beyond her years. Are you going to fix it? I'm going to try, even if fixing it means breaking something else. What else? Maybe everything I've built. Maybe my whole company. Zuri looked at her sleeping mother, then back at him. Mama always says, doing the right thing is hard. That's how you know it's right, because it costs you something. Out of the mouths of babes, Ethan thought. Your mother is a wise woman. Yeah. Zuri smiled slightly. She is. That night, Ethan sat in his car in the hospital parking lot and read through every document Dorothy had sent. By the time he finished, dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that Sarah would have loved. He thought about the 2 photographs he now carried in his wallet, Sarah's picture and Zuri's drawing. One representing the life he'd lost, the other representing the life he'd never noticed he was destroying. Then he picked up his phone and called his lawyer. I need you to prepare a comprehensive disclosure package, he said. Everything related to Summit Industrial Fabrication, Brennan Holdings, and the warehouse fire from 3 years ago. I'm going to release it publicly. His lawyer sputtered. That's career suicide. The board will remove you. Investors will flee. You could face criminal charges. I know. Do it anyway. Ethan, think about what you're doing. I have thought about it. For the first time in a long time, I'm actually thinking about what my choices mean. He looked up at the hospital building, at the window where Amara and Zuri would be waking soon. Prepare the documents. I'll tell you when to release them. He ended the call and sat in the golden morning light, feeling strangely calm. His empire might fall, His reputation might be destroyed. He might lose everything he'd spent decades building. But for the first time since Sarah died, Ethan Caldwell felt like he was building something that mattered more than money. He felt like he was building a soul. The manila envelope arrived at Ethan's office on a gray Thursday morning, delivered by Dorothy Brennan herself, rather than through courier. She placed it on his desk with the weight of someone handling evidence in a murder trial. "Everything you asked for," she said quietly. "Every contract, every forged signature, every payment to the inspector and fire marshal. It's all documented." Ethan opened the envelope slowly. Inside were hundreds of pages, emails, financial records, safety reports that had been intercepted and buried. Amara Carter's name appeared repeatedly, her warnings growing more urgent with each report until they simply stopped after the fire. "There's something else," Dorothy added, pulling out a separate folder. "I found this at the warehouse site. The city demolished most of it 2 years ago, but I got access to the remaining evidence locker." She handed him a photograph of a charred metal pendant, roughly the size of a quarter. Even damaged by fire, Ethan could make out the engraved initials. AC. "Amara Carter," he whispered. It was catalogued as unidentified evidence. No one ever claimed it because the families were never properly notified about what personal effects survived. Dorothy's voice carried quiet anger. They bulldozed that warehouse and erased what happened there as quickly as they could. Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind connecting dots he'd been avoiding. "Can I get the actual pendant?" "Already arranged. It should arrive tomorrow." Dorothy sat down across from his desk. "Ethan, before you do whatever you're planning to do, you need to understand the full scope. Greg didn't just cover up one fire. I found evidence of safety violations at 4 other facilities, all swept under the rug the same way. You release this and it's not just him going down. Who else? Your CFO knew. Your head of operations. At least 3 board members received reports about liability concerns that they chose to ignore." She leaned forward. "Your entire executive team built a system designed to hide problems instead of fixing them. They used your name and your signature, forged but convincing, to authorize it all." The betrayal cut deeper than Ethan expected. These were people he'd worked with for years, people he'd trusted to run his empire while he focused on expansion. They'd turned that trust into a machine that crushed people like Marcus Carter and called it efficiency. "How many people died in total, across all the incidents?" Dorothy's expression hardened. 26 confirmed. Another 43 injured seriously enough to end their careers. Hundreds more affected by the aftermath, families without income, medical bills, trauma. 26 lives. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "Send copies to the federal prosecutors. Today. The moment I do that, there's no taking it back. Your company will be under investigation. The stock will crash. Your board will move against you. I know. They'll destroy you, Ethan. These are powerful people with expensive lawyers. They'll make you the scapegoat for everything they did in your name. Then they'll have to get in line." Ethan stood and walked to his office window, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, Zuri was sitting in a classroom, trying to focus on math problems while worrying about whether her mother would be alive when she got home. "I'm done protecting people who treat human lives like line items on a balance sheet." Dorothy stood as well. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. It's just going to hurt like hell. The right things usually do." After Dorothy left, Ethan sat alone in his office, the envelope of evidence seeming to pulse with its own dark energy. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Caldwell, the board has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They're demanding your attendance." Of course they were. His recent behavior, the missed meetings, the unexplained absences, the viral video that still haunted the company's social media, had finally pushed them to action. "Tell them I'll be there," Ethan said. He spent the afternoon preparing, not for the board meeting, but for the hospital. He'd promised Zuri he'd help her with a school project about family history, and he wasn't going to break that promise just because his world was about to implode. At St. Mary's, he found Zuri in the common area, surrounded by poster board and markers. Amara sat nearby in a wheelchair, her color better than it had been weeks ago, but still fragile. "You're late," Zuri announced, not looking up from her work. "I know. I'm sorry." "Mama says, sorry doesn't count unless you mean it and do better next time." Ethan smiled despite everything. "Your mama's right. I'll do better. Next time." He sat down and looked at Zuri's project. She'd drawn a family tree with careful attention to detail. Marcus Carter's name sat at the top next to Amara's, with a line connecting them to Zuri's name below. But the branches above Marcus and Amara were mostly empty. "I don't know much about my grandparents," Zuri explained. "Daddy's parents died before I was born. Mama's mama is in Atlanta, but we don't talk to her much." "Why not?" Ethan asked gently. Amara answered from her wheelchair. "My mother didn't approve of Marcus, thought I was marrying beneath myself." Her voice carried old pain. "She said I told you so after the fire, haven't spoken to her since." The casual cruelty of that stole Ethan's breath. "I'm sorry." "People make choices," Amara said simply. "She made hers. I made mine." Zuri added more details to her poster, carefully writing dates and places. Ethan watched her work. This child who'd lost so much but still approached her family history with pride instead of bitterness. "Mr. Caldwell?" Zuri looked up at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why don't you have kids?" The question was innocent but pierced something deep. "My wife and I wanted children, but she got sick before we could. After she died, I didn't think about it anymore." "That's sad." Zuri returned to her drawing. "You'd probably be a good dad. You're patient, and you help with homework without getting mad when I don't understand stuff." Ethan's throat tightened. "That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me." "It's true, though. You fixed Mama's TV remote when it broke, and you brought me those books. And you sit with us even when you probably have important billionaire stuff to do." "There's nothing more important than this," Ethan said, and realized he meant it completely. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant. The board meeting would start in an hour. He needed to leave soon if he was going to make it. But instead, he stayed and helped Zuri finish her project, adding details and colors until the family tree looked like something worth presenting. When they were done, Zuri beamed at it with satisfaction. "Thanks, Mr. Caldwell." "Ethan," he corrected. "Just Ethan." She grinned. "Thanks, Ethan." He left the hospital feeling lighter than he had any right to feel given what awaited him. The pendant Dorothy had recovered arrived while he was driving back to the office, delivered to his car by courier. He opened the small box at a red light and stared at the damaged metal, at Amara's initials marked forever by fire. This was what his empire had been built on, the charred remnants of other people's lives. He put the pendant in his pocket and drove to face his board. The conference room was silent when Ethan entered, 15 minutes late. The board members sat around the long table like judges at a trial, their expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. Greg Stanton sat at the far end, his posture relaxed and confident. "Thank you for joining us, Ethan," said Margaret Winters, the board chair. Her tone suggested thanks was the last thing she felt. "We've been discussing your recent behavior and its impact on the company." Ethan took his seat at the head of the table. "I'm aware of the concerns." "Are you?" Greg leaned forward. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you've completely lost focus. Missed meetings, erratic decisions, that disaster with the child that's still trending online. Investors are nervous, Ethan. We need leadership, not whatever this is." "What this is," Ethan said calmly, is me paying attention for the first time in years. Paying attention to what? Margaret asked. To viral videos and bad publicity? To the people we've hurt building this company. The silence that followed was heavy with confusion and dawning alarm. I don't understand, said David Park, the CFO. What people? Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the file Dorothy had sent him. Let me ask you all a question. Does anyone remember Summit Industrial Fabrication? Several board members exchanged glances. Greg's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Should we? Margaret asked. You should. It was one of our contracted facilities. 3 years ago, there was a fire that killed 18 people and injured dozens more. The facility had documented safety violations that were ignored. The inspector was bribed. The fire marshal was paid off, and it was all authorized using my signature. Forged, but official-looking enough to give everyone plausible deniability. Ethan, what are you talking about? David's voice had risen slightly. I don't know anything about this. Don't you? Ethan pulled out a printed email and slid it across the table. This is from you to Greg, discussing liability management at 3 facilities, including Summit. You recommended minimal intervention to preserve profit margins. David's face went pale as he read the email. This is absurd, Greg said, his voice sharp. These are isolated incidents, routine business decisions taken out of context. You're constructing a conspiracy theory out of normal operations. Normal operations that killed 26 people across multiple facilities. Ethan's voice remained level, but steel ran underneath it. Normal operations that destroyed families and then buried the evidence. You have no proof of any systematic wrongdoing, Greg countered. And even if there were issues, they were handled at the operational level. The board wasn't involved. Except 3 board members received quarterly reports about these issues and chose to ignore them. Ethan named them, watching their faces change. I have the documentation. All of it. Margaret stood abruptly. This is completely inappropriate. If you have concerns about operational compliance, they should be directed to our legal team, not weaponized in a board meeting. I've already sent copies to the federal prosecutors, Ethan said calmly. As of this morning, this company is under investigation. The room erupted. Several board members started shouting at once. Greg's confident mask finally cracked, replaced by cold fury. Margaret's hand shook as she pointed at Ethan. You've destroyed this company, she said. Whatever vendetta you're pursuing, you've just killed everything we built. No, Ethan corrected. I've exposed what we built it on. There's a difference. The shareholders will crucify you for this, David said. The stock will be worthless by tomorrow. I know. Then why? Margaret's voice carried genuine confusion now. Why would you do this to your own company? Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant, placing it on the polished conference table. The charred metal looked obscene against the expensive wood. Because this belonged to a woman named Amara Carter. She was a safety supervisor at Summit who tried to stop what happened. She wrote report after report warning about the dangers. Every single one was intercepted and buried. Her husband died in the fire she tried to prevent. She survived, but her lungs were destroyed. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. She has an 8-year-old daughter named Zuri. That daughter stole my wallet 3 weeks ago because she was trying to pay her mother's medical bills. Bills that exist because we decided safety regulations cost too much. That little girl looked at me with terror in her eyes because I chased her through the streets like a criminal for trying to save her mother's life. This is about one family. Greg's voice dripped with contempt. You're destroying a multi-billion-dollar company over one family. No. I'm destroying it over 26 dead workers, 43 injured, hundreds of families affected, and a system that treats human beings as acceptable losses. Ethan stood. I'm destroying it because it deserves to be destroyed. Because what we built here was a machine that killed people and called it efficiency. You're insane, Margaret whispered. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally sane after years of being comfortably numb. Greg stood as well, his face flushed with anger. You sanctimonious hypocrite. You built this company. You signed off on the growth strategies, the cost-cutting measures, the outsourcing. You can't claim innocence now just because you feel guilty about some unfortunate accidents. They weren't accidents. They were predictable results of decisions we made to prioritize profits over people. And yes, I'm responsible too. That's exactly why I'm doing this. The board will remove you, Margaret said. Immediately. We'll vote right now. Go ahead. Ethan picked up the pendant. But the prosecutors already have the evidence. Removing me won't stop what's coming. The vote was unanimous, as he'd expected. 13 voices saying yes to his removal. 1 abstention, 1 vote, his own. That didn't matter. Effective. Immediately, Ethan Caldwell was no longer CEO of the company that bore his name. You're done, Greg said as Ethan walked to the door. Not just here, everywhere. We'll make sure everyone knows you're a traitor to your own company. You'll never work in finance again. Ethan turned back. Good. I wouldn't want to. He left the building through the lobby, past the massive portrait of himself that hung in the entrance, past the receptionist who didn't meet his eyes, past the security guards who watched him go with expressions caught between confusion and respect. Outside, protesters had already gathered. Word of the investigation had leaked faster than he'd expected. Some held signs supporting the workers' families. Others demanded his arrest. The news cameras captured all of it, his walk of shame that felt strangely like liberation. His phone exploded with notifications, colleagues distancing themselves, investors demanding answers, lawyers offering to represent him. His assistant called 6 times in 3 minutes before he turned the phone off completely. It was over. His empire, his reputation, everything he'd spent decades building, gone in a single afternoon. Ethan sat in his car in the parking garage, still wearing his suit but no longer belonging to the building above him. He should feel devastated, he thought. He should feel the crushing weight of failure. Instead, he felt like he could breathe for the first time in years. He drove to St. Mary's Hospital as the sun set over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. The news was already breaking. Every channel showing his face, analyzing his fall, debating whether he was a hero or a fool. When he entered Amara's room, she was watching the television mounted on the wall, Zuri curled up beside her on the hospital bed. They both turned when they heard him enter. "We saw," Amara said quietly, "what you did." Ethan pulled out the pendant and held it out to her. "I believe this belongs to you." Amara's hand trembled as she took it, tears immediately streaming down her face. "I thought it was lost. I thought everything from that day was just gone. Someone kept it. Someone documented it. The truth was always there, just buried." Ethan sat down in the plastic chair that had become his usual spot. "I'm sorry I didn't find it sooner." Zuri looked between the pendant and the television screen, where his face still dominated the news. "Are you going to be okay?" "Honestly, I don't know. But I'm more okay right now than I've been in a long time." "You lost everything," Zuri said, her voice small. "Because of us." "No." Ethan leaned forward. "I lost things that didn't matter, and I found something that does." Amara clutched the pendant to her chest, still crying. "You didn't have to do this. You could have walked away." "I know. But your daughter taught me that walking away isn't the same as being innocent." They sat together in the hospital room as darkness fell outside and the city lights flickered on. The television continued its coverage of his fall, but none of them watched anymore. They simply sat in the quiet solidarity of people who'd found each other in unexpected ways. Outside, the storm Ethan had unleashed was just beginning. Federal investigators were already serving warrants. Greg Stanton's lawyer was scheduling press conferences. The board was scrambling to contain the damage. But inside room 347, none of that mattered. An 8-year-old girl, her mother, and a former billionaire sat together in the gathering darkness, bound by truths that couldn't be hidden anymore, and losses that couldn't be measured in dollars. "Thank you," Amara whispered, breaking the long silence, "for giving me this back, for seeing us when the world didn't." Ethan looked at the pendant in her hands, at Zuri's small face still worried despite his reassurances, at the simple hospital room that had become more important than his corner office ever was. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me what it means to be human." The news anchor's voice was clinical, almost detached, as she reported what had become the biggest financial scandal in years. Behind her, a split screen showed Ethan's professional headshot alongside footage of the demolished warehouse where Marcus Carter died. Former billionaire Ethan Caldwell appeared on national television this morning to make what can only be described as a stunning confession. In a prepared statement, Caldwell detailed a pattern of corporate negligence, safety violations, and systematic cover-ups that allegedly resulted in at least 26 deaths over a 3-year period. Ethan sat in a borrowed studio chair, wearing a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual custom suits. The makeup artist had offered to cover the dark circles under his eyes, but he'd declined. He wanted people to see exactly what this truth cost. "Mr. Caldwell," the interviewer began, her expression carefully neutral, "you've just destroyed your own company and implicated dozens of executives, including yourself. Why come forward now?" "Because silence makes you complicit," Ethan said simply. "I built a company that prioritized profits over human lives. I delegated responsibilities to people who used my name to authorize decisions I never reviewed. That ignorance doesn't make me innocent, it makes me guilty in a different way. You've named specific individuals, including your COO Greg Stanton, your CFO David Park, and 3 board members. Are you claiming they acted without your knowledge? I'm claiming I created an environment where that kind of behavior was possible, where quarterly profits mattered more than workplace safety, where human beings became acceptable losses." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to play victim. I'm here to take responsibility for building a system that killed people. Some are calling you a hero for exposing this. Others say you're a traitor trying to save your own reputation. Which is it?" "Neither. I'm just a man who finally opened his eyes." The interviewer pulled out a document. "We've obtained a list of the victims' families. Many of them are watching right now. What would you say to them?" Ethan looked directly at the camera. "I'm sorry. Those words are completely inadequate, but they're all I have. I'm sorry your loved ones died because people like me decided safety regulations were too expensive. I'm sorry you were offered minimal settlements while my company reported record profits. I'm sorry it took me 3 years and a stolen wallet to understand what my choices cost." A stolen wallet. The interviewer's confusion was genuine. "That's a longer story." Ethan almost smiled. "But yes, sometimes it takes a child to show you what you've become." Within hours of the broadcast, the internet exploded. Social media divided sharply between those who saw Ethan as courageous and those who saw him as calculating. The hashtag #WarCaldwellConfession trended worldwide, with think pieces and hot takes multiplying by the minute. But more importantly, federal investigators moved quickly. By noon, Greg Stanton was arrested on fraud and conspiracy charges. By evening, warrants were served on David Park and 2 board members. The company's stock crashed so hard trading was temporarily halted. Protesters gathered outside the Caldwell Financial Building. Not the angry mob from before, but grieving families holding photos of loved ones lost in the fires and accidents that had been buried and forgotten. News crews captured every face, every sign, every tear. Ethan watched the coverage from a cheap motel room in Queens, the kind of place he'd never noticed when he lived in luxury. His mansion was being seized as part of the investigation, His bank accounts were frozen. Everything he owned was either evidence or collateral damage. He'd kept his phone off for 3 days, but finally turned it on to find 847 missed calls and over 2,000 messages. Most he deleted without reading. But one message made him pause. It was from Zuri, sent from the hospital's administrative line. "Come back when you can. Mama wants to see you. P.S. You were really brave on TV." Ethan sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at that message until his vision blurred. A little girl thought he was brave. The same girl who'd stolen his wallet because the world he built gave her no other choice. Now thought he was brave for tearing that world down. He caught a bus to the hospital. His car had been impounded, sitting among people who probably had no idea who he was without the expensive suit and confident bearing. An elderly woman offered him her seat, mistaking his exhaustion for illness. He thanked her and remained standing, oddly grateful for the simple kindness. St. Mary's felt like coming home. The nurse at the front desk, Patricia, smiled when she saw him. "Wondered when you'd show up," she said. "Room 347's been asking about you. How is she?" "Amara? Getting stronger every day. Doctors say she might be able to go home next month if she keeps improving." Patricia's smile widened. "First time in years I've seen that kind of progress. Whatever you did, it worked." What he did. Ethan thought about that phrase as he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. He'd destroyed his company, ended his career, and exposed crimes that would send people to prison, but he'd also paid medical bills that saved a life and given a little girl hope that the world could be different. Maybe that balance was the best anyone could hope for. Amara was sitting up when he entered, her color better than he'd ever seen it. Zuri was doing homework at the fold-out table, but she jumped up when she saw him. "Ethan, we saw you on TV. You told everyone the truth." He'd asked her to call him Ethan weeks ago, but it still warmed something in his chest every time she did. "I did." "Were you scared?" "Terrified. But you did it anyway." Zuri's eyes were wide with admiration. "That's what bravery is, right, Mama? Being scared but doing the right thing anyway? That's exactly what it is, baby." Amara gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Sit down, Ethan. You look exhausted." He sat, feeling the weight of the past few days settle over him like a physical presence. "I wanted to make sure you both knew. The investigation might involve you. They'll want to interview you, Amara, about the safety reports you filed, about Marcus. It might bring up painful memories." "I know." Amara's voice was steady. "A federal agent already came by. I told her everything I remember. If my testimony helps put those people in prison, then Marcus's death will mean something." "It already means something," Ethan said quietly. "It meant everything to Zuri, and now it's going to mean justice." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Zuri spoke up again. "Are you poor now?" "Zuri!" Amara's tone was scandalized, but Ethan laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. "It's a fair question, and yes, compared to before, I'm poor. My accounts are frozen, my assets seized. I'm staying in a motel and taking the bus." "The bus isn't so bad," Zuri offered consolingly. "You meet interesting people." "I'm learning that." "What will you do now?" Amara asked more seriously. "After all this is over?" Ethan hadn't let himself think that far ahead. The immediate crisis had consumed everything. The investigation, the interviews, the fallout. But now, sitting in this hospital room with people who'd somehow become his anchor, he realized he had no idea what came next. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm not qualified for anything except finance, and I don't think anyone will hire me after this." "You could teach," Zuri suggested. "You're good at explaining math stuff." "Or work with people," Amara added. "You spent weeks visiting us, helping with small things, just being present. That takes a different kind of skill." "Maybe." Ethan looked at them both. This woman, and child who'd transformed his life by stealing his wallet. Whatever I do, it needs to matter. Not to shareholders or board members, but to real people. To families like yours who've been hurt by people like me. Like you were, Amara corrected gently. You're not that person anymore. How can you be sure? Because that person wouldn't be sitting in this hospital room right now. He'd be hiding behind lawyers and PR firms, protecting what he could salvage. Amara reached over and squeezed his hand. You chose to lose everything rather than let the lies continue. That's not who you were. That's who you are. The distinction hit Ethan hard. Who he was versus who he is. The past versus the present. The man who built an empire versus the man who tore it down. The agent who interviewed me, Amara continued. She said she's been investigating corporate negligence cases for 15 years. She said whistleblowers usually try to negotiate immunity deals to protect themselves. But you didn't. You just handed over everything and said you were guilty too. Because I am. Yes. But most people in your position wouldn't admit it. Amara's grip tightened. You gave up everything to make sure Marcus and the others aren't forgotten. That means something to me, to Zuri, to all the families who've been carrying grief alone because no one with power would acknowledge what happened. Ethan had to look away, his composure threatening to break. Through the window, the city stretched out in all its complicated glory. Beauty and ugliness mixed together, wealth and poverty existing side by side, human lives playing out in millions of individual stories that rarely intersected except by accident. Or theft. Sometimes it took theft to force those intersections. I want to start something, he said suddenly, the idea forming as he spoke. A foundation or organization that helps families affected by corporate negligence. Something that advocates for workers' safety, that investigates violations, that makes sure what happened to you doesn't keep happening to others. With what money? Zuri asked practically. Ethan smiled. That's an excellent question. I have no idea, but I'll figure it out. You could call it after Daddy, Zuri suggested, her voice going soft. The Marcus Carter Foundation. Amara's eyes filled with tears. The Carter Initiative, she amended, for all the workers and families, not just Marcus. Make it bigger than one person. The Carter Initiative, Ethan repeated, testing the words. I like that. Over the following weeks, as summer turned to fall, the full scope of the scandal continued to unfold. Greg Stanton's trial became national news, with victims' families testifying about lives destroyed and futures stolen. David Park accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against other executives. The board members faced both criminal charges and civil suits. Ethan testified at every proceeding, never hiding behind the Fifth Amendment or claiming ignorance. He laid out exactly how his obsession with growth had created an environment where safety was negotiable and human life was a cost-benefit analysis. Some prosecutors pushed for charges against him too, but ultimately the evidence showed what Amara had said. He'd been negligent and morally culpable, but the criminal conspiracy had been orchestrated without his direct knowledge. It didn't absolve him, but it meant he wouldn't go to prison. Instead, he faced a different kind of sentence, rebuilding a life from nothing while carrying the weight of what his nothing had cost others. The cheap motel became a small apartment in Brooklyn, close to the hospital. His expensive wardrobe was replaced with thrift store finds. He learned to cook basic meals instead of dining out. He discovered that grocery store coffee was actually fine once you got used to it. And every evening, after spending his days meeting with lawyers or giving depositions, he would visit room 347. Until finally, there was no more room 347 to visit. 1 year after the stolen wallet, Amara Carter was released from the hospital. Her lungs would never be perfect, but with proper medication and regular checkups, the doctors believed she could live a relatively normal life. Ethan helped them move into a modest apartment in a building that had working heat and windows that actually closed properly. a significant upgrade from where they'd lived before. It wasn't much, but it was safe and clean, and theirs. "You didn't have to do all this," Amara said as she surveyed the furnished living room Ethan had quietly arranged. "The security deposit, the furniture, the first month's rent. I wanted to." Ethan was setting up a bookshelf that Zuri had specifically requested. "Besides, it's not like I'm spending money on expensive suits anymore." "Still," Amara sat down carefully on the new couch, still building her strength. "You've given us so much. You gave me more. You gave me back my humanity." Zuri burst out of her new bedroom, her face glowing. "Mama, I have my own closet, an actual closet." Her joy over something so simple, something Ethan had never thought twice about in his previous life, made his chest ache in a way that was both painful and precious. That evening, as boxes were unpacked and furniture was arranged, there was a knock at the door. Ethan answered to find a courier holding a manila envelope. "Ethan Caldwell?" "Yes. Sign here, please." The envelope contained notification that Caldwell Financial had officially declared bankruptcy. All remaining assets would be liquidated to pay settlements to victims' families. The company he'd built over 20 years would cease to exist by the end of the month. Ethan held the papers and felt nothing. No grief, no regret. Just a quiet acceptance that this chapter was finally, completely closed. "Bad news?" Amara asked, reading his expression. "N news," he corrected. "The company's gone. It's official. How do you feel?" Ethan looked around the small apartment, at Zuri arranging her books on the new shelf, at Amara resting on a couch she'd never have been able to afford without his help, at the simple space that represented survival and hope rather than luxury and excess. "Free," he said finally. "I feel free." The following months brought unexpected developments. Other whistleblowers, inspired by Ethan's confession, came forward with evidence of negligence at different companies. A congressional committee launched investigations into workplace safety enforcement. New regulations were proposed, debated, and eventually passed. Marcus Carter's name appeared in legislation. The Carter Workplace Safety Act. Zuri cut the article out of the newspaper and hung it on her bedroom wall, next to a picture of her father that Amara had salvaged from their old apartment. "Daddy's helping people even though he's gone," she told Ethan one afternoon when he stopped by to fix a leaking faucet. "That's pretty cool, right?" "That's incredibly cool. You're helping people too, even though you lost all your money." She looked up at him with those sharp, perceptive eyes. "I think maybe that's better than being rich." "Some days it feels that way," Ethan admitted. "Other days I miss having money for groceries." "We can share our groceries," Zuri offered seriously. Mama bought extra mac and cheese. The simple generosity of a child who'd once been so desperate she stole a wallet, now offering to share her food with a former billionaire, was almost too much. Ethan had to clear his throat before he could respond. "Thank you, Zuri. That means a lot." The Carter Initiative officially launched on the anniversary of Marcus's death, a small non-profit operating out of a donated office space, staffed by volunteers and funded by settlement money, that Ethan convinced the courts to redirect toward helping other affected families. Amara became the administrative director, her first-hand experience with corporate negligence making her invaluable. Ethan worked as an unpaid advocate, using his knowledge of corporate structures to identify safety violations before they became tragedies. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't wealthy, but it was real in a way his previous life had never been. The dedication ceremony for the initiative was small, just a few dozen people in a community center, folding chairs and homemade refreshments. But among those people were families whose loved ones had died in the same fires and accidents that killed Marcus. People who'd been fighting alone for years, suddenly finding community and support. Ethan stood at the podium, looking out at faces that represented both tragedy and resilience. A year ago, he began. "A little girl stole my wallet. At the time, I thought I was the victim of a crime. I chased her through the streets. I called the police. I let anger and self-righteousness blind me to what was actually happening." He found Zuri in the crowd, sitting next to her mother, in the front row. She gave him a small wave. What I didn't understand was that she wasn't stealing from me. She was surviving in a world that people like me had built. A world where an 8-year-old child had to choose between being a thief and watching her mother die. A world where corporate profits mattered more than human lives. The room was silent, everyone listening. That little girl taught me something crucial. That ignoring suffering doesn't make you innocent. That closing your eyes to injustice makes you complicit in it. That sometimes the only way forward is to tear down everything you've built and start over with a foundation of truth instead of profit. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The Carter Initiative exists because of Marcus Carter, who died trying to do his job safely, because of Amara Carter, who fought to prevent his death and was ignored, and because of Zuri Carter, who showed me that real wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything. The applause was quiet but sustained, the kind that comes from genuine respect rather than politeness. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, a reporter approached Ethan. She was young, earnest, with a recording device in hand. "Mr. Caldwell, can I ask you a question?" "Just Ethan." "And yes. Do you regret it? Destroying your company, losing your wealth, giving up everything you built?" Ethan looked around the room, at families finding comfort in shared experiences, at Amara discussing strategy with other victims, at Zuri showing a younger child her drawing of hope that still lived in his wallet. "A year ago, I had billions of dollars and felt empty every single day," he said quietly. "Today, I have about $600 in my bank account. I take the bus everywhere, and I eat a lot of mac and cheese, and I wake up every morning feeling like my life actually matters. So that's a no?" "That's a no." Ethan smiled. "The truth is, I didn't lose everything that day I chased Zuri through Manhattan. I found everything. I just had to let go of what I thought was valuable to discover what actually is." The reporter scribbled notes. "One last question. If you could go back and change what happened, would you?" Ethan thought about that morning in the cafe, about the small figure in a red hoodie, about the moment his wallet disappeared and his entire world shifted. "No," he said finally, "because that little girl's theft saved 2 lives, her mother's and mine." 5 years later, the Carter Initiative had expanded to 12 cities, helping hundreds of families and successfully advocating for stronger workplace safety regulations. The original office had been replaced by a proper facility, funded by grants and donations from people who believed in the mission. Ethan still worked there, now as the official director of advocacy programs. He'd never gotten rich again, didn't want to. His apartment was still small, his wardrobe still thrift store, his car still ancient. But every evening he would stop by the house Amara and Zuri had moved into 2 years ago. A real house with a yard and a porch and enough space for Zuri to spread out her constantly multiplying collection of books. He'd have dinner with them, help Zuri with increasingly complex homework, listen to Amara's stories about the families they were helping. They'd become his family in ways that bloodlines couldn't measure. On the 5-year anniversary of the wallet theft, Zuri, now 13 and already showing signs of the fierce advocate she would become, presented Ethan with a gift. It was a frame containing 2 items, his photograph of Sarah and her childhood drawing with the word, "Hope." "You kept them both," she said, smiling. "In your wallet all these years. I thought they deserved better than that." Ethan's hands shook as he took the frame. "Zuri, this is... You told me once that the most important things can't be measured in dollars." She interrupted. "These are important, not because they're worth money, but because they remind you who you were and who you became. He hung the frame in his small office at the Initiative, where it joined pictures of Marcus Carter and the other workers whose lives had been lost and whose memories now drove the mission forward. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the office was empty, Ethan would sit and look at that frame, at Sarah's smile and Zuri's simple drawing, and marvel at the strange path his life had taken. How a moment of anger and pride had led to understanding, how a stolen wallet had returned everything that actually mattered. And he'd think about that morning in Manhattan, about a little girl in a red hoodie who'd bumped into him and changed his life forever, who'd stolen his wallet and, in doing so, stolen the comfortable fiction that let him ignore the cost of his choices. She'd been right that day in the alley when she'd looked at him with terrified defiance and said, "It's not yours anymore. The wallet, the company, the empire of indifference, none of it had been his to keep. It had all been built on borrowed time and other people's suffering. But the truth was his now, and it had set him free in ways that wealth never could." Ethan looked up at the frame one last time before turning off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new families to help, new battles to fight, new opportunities to make sure that what happened to Marcus Carter and so many others would happen to fewer people going forward. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was real, and it was honest, and it was built on a foundation of truth instead of profit. And that, Ethan had learned, was the only kind of wealth that actually mattered. Outside, the city lights flickered on as night fell over Manhattan, the same streets where a billionaire had once chased a child, where judgment had given way to understanding, where everything had changed, because a little girl was brave enough to steal, and a man was finally brave enough to see. The truth hadn't destroyed him. It had set him free. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. When faced with uncomfortable truths about the systems we benefit from, do we have the courage to tear down our own empires, or do we choose the comfort of willful ignorance? If this story made you think twice about the unseen costs of success, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge how we see the world.